French President Emmanuel Macron, in a major televised speech tonight, or actually a television discussion, went further than he has ever gone before in claiming that he may be forced, to use his words, to use military power in Ukraine against Russia. He came as close as he has ever come at any point to say French troops could be sent in to fight that, and that Russia, quote, must lose. Now, we're going to show you some of the clips of what he said there, and I'm going to show you a couple of other things that were reported in French press. Otherwise, talk about some of the things that he has specifically said and claimed, and we're going to tell you just how dangerous this is. Now, I'll also tell you we're actually trying to bring Doug Macgregor in right now. He's out of the state right now and may join us by phone. If he does, we'll patch him right in because he's got some great things to say on this and terrific understanding of how all these things work together. But in the meantime, we're going to go ahead and just jump right in here because the things that he said there have raised the stakes dramatically for the possibility of this war to expand beyond the borders of Ukraine. The thing that we have feared the most, that we have worked the hardest to keep the war contained to where it was and not escalate, and definitely not to go nuclear, is now at increasing risk because of an emotional move by the president of France. First of all, here is a small clip of what Macron said on there. For any of you who may not be able to read the subtitles on your phones, I'll go ahead and read the translation of what he said. Go ahead and play that, Gary.
Une guerre qui est existentielle pour notre Europe et pour la France. J'espère qu'on y reviendra parce que c'est un sujet clé. Et donc, je décide, parce qu'après 2 ans de guerre, après d'ailleurs, je veux ici le rappeler, que nous ayons systématiquement fait ce que nous disions que nous n'allions pas faire. Ce qui relativise aussi les propos très définitifs tenus parfois par certains à travers l'Europe. Il y a 2 ans, nous disions jamais on n'enverra de chars. On l'a fait. Il y a 2 ans, on disait jamais nous n'enverrons de missiles de moyenne portée. On l'a fait. Mais on disait jamais on enverra d'avions. Certains sont en train de le faire. Donc, nous avons mis trop de limites, si je puis dire, dans notre vocabulaire. Nous ne sommes pas dans l'escalade. Nous ne sommes pas en guerre contre la Russie. Simplement, il faut être clair, nous ne devons pas laisser la Russie gagner.
So, he's saying, really talking out of both sides of his mouth at the same time. He's saying we're not at war with Russia, but we cannot let them win. He continues to say, as he said, implied in that particular place, that even though we said all these things we wouldn't do at the beginning, we ended up doing them. And by implication, it didn't draw us into the war, meaning Russia doesn't have any red lines. Well, I think that's a pretty poor gamble there because it's very clear, as we'll see in a minute, that Russia does have red lines. Now, we have joining us here by phone, Doug Macgregor. Doug, super glad you could make a chance to come on here. And I just wonder if you could kind of give us real quick your impressions of what Macron is saying, especially about that he didn't have any red lines and he is willing to send troops into Ukraine if Russia starts making more progress.
Well, there are a couple of things to consider. First of all, President Macron received a report from the French Ministry of Defense indicating that Ukraine's collapse militarily and probably politically and economically is imminent. In other words, the Ukrainian military is thoroughly defeated. That's the first part. Secondly, he was also told under no uncertain terms that the French military has very little to send to Ukraine. And thus, what he's doing publicly is very different from what he was advised to do privately, because the French military has said, what do you plan to send? We're not organized or equipped to fight in eastern Ukraine, let alone stop the Russians if they decide to move west. So he's trying to, what's the right word, I suppose, grandstand on the world stage, posture as a world leader who is standing up to the evil Russians and will send Frenchmen to fight and die for the independence of Ukraine. Now, that's a lot of nonsense because Ukraine is hardly democratic. It's practically a Stalinist state run by a secret police and reports to Zelensky. The second part of it is no one in Europe wants to join him, and he knows that. So what he's essentially doing is bluffing. Now, bluffing is very dangerous because if the Russians decide to take him seriously, they find any evidence for any French troops on the ground in Ukraine, they could simply attack metropolitan France. And that would put him in a terrible position. Finally, he, like all of the globalist leaders in Western Europe, have followed us down the path to hell in Ukraine. They see clearly that we're looking for a way out. He wants to find a way out as well, but he can't do that very easily. So he's doing the opposite in the hopes that he'll end up being the only man out there arguing for anything substantive. He can pretend to have been betrayed by NATO and his allies, which of course is all nonsense. So the whole thing is a bluff. It's designed to help him at home. It's not going to help him. He's in very poor shape in the polls, and he's not going to survive much longer in office.
And so, what do you make of some of these comments from Vladimir Putin in Russia? Because I think that he has taken a lot of this in stride, but in the last couple of weeks, especially, he's been making more and more strident comments, like this one a few days ago, specifically talking about the possibility of Western troops in Western Ukraine.
They're talking about the possibility of sending NATO military contingents to Ukraine. But we remember the fate of those who once sent their contingents to our country. But now, the consequences for possible interventionists will be much more tragic. We also have weapons. They know about this. As I just said, we also have a weapon that can hit targets on their territory. And they should understand that what they're doing now, trying to scare the whole world,
Doug. There's a translation of
it does risk a
can't hear
conflict with nuclear
Well,
weapons.
that's all right. I mean, I've heard,
which means the
President
destruction of
Putin speak on this,
civilization.
and I think what's happened is that in Moscow, his advisors have said, look, the probability of anything happening is very low. The Europeans are in no position to do anything, certainly not without the United States. We're the ones that have, as you would call them, the force multipliers, and we're not going to commit those. However, I think he was advised that it was time to make it abundantly clear that if President Macron is serious and attempts anything, that he's going to be at war with Russia, and Russia will spare nothing to defeat France. I think that's the message.
And so, in the event that what you're saying is right, and he's bluffing, I mean, it seems a very foolish and highly risky thing to do for France, because he's basically laid out. He said France, and not laid out, he expressly said it is an existential issue for France specifically. If Russia wins, it means we no longer have security. Well, if Russia does go ahead and win, and God forbid if there should be any escalation and somehow it ends up just with Ukraine losing, and then all of a sudden France is not at existential risk, I mean, he comes off looking pretty foolish. This seems like a really high gamble stakes, a risk.
Well, from his standpoint, he is scheduled for elimination as president anyway. So from his vantage point, this is not high risk, because he knows no one is going to back him up. No one is going to support him. He's entirely on his own. His statements are not being taken seriously anywhere in the West. And finally, the only existential threat to France is much like the existential threat to us. It's internal to the country. And in his case, he's talking about 1 in 5 citizens who are Muslims and Arabs or Africans. And that's the threat that France has to deal with and figure out what it's going to do to preserve itself and its culture and national identity. He faces what was outlined in the camp of the saints many years ago. So there's no existential threat from Russia at all. I think there are enough sober-minded people in France to understand that. So this is a gamble, but not the one that you're articulating. It's really a desperate attempt to entrench himself as president at a point in time where the ground under his feet is collapsing.
Well, I certainly hope that's the way it turns out, because I've seen too many times where foolish decisions were made by politicians thinking they were going to do one thing, and then things take a life of their own. I know you don't have much time here, so let me ask you one more question before you get out. And that is, what do you think that the United States is going to do? How is President Biden going to respond to this when I'm sure he's going to be asked?
He's going to make it clear that the United States will not send any forces to Ukraine. He will reiterate what he's already stated in public. And he would say, I think that Mr. Macron's sentiments are laudable, but not terribly practical at this point. And the best we can do is to waste more money on equipment for Ukrainians that they'll probably not be around to utilize anyway. You know, some of this is reminiscent of something that happened while I was on active duty, and that was the Kosovo air campaign. Prime Minister Tony Blair said that he was prepared to send 40 or 50,000 British troops to fight in Kosovo. And of course, at the time, I had numbers of British officers working for me, and they all turned, looked, and laughed and said, well, we're all interested to find out where they're coming from because we don't know of any. And at the time, they would have had to mobilize reserves that were in no position to take the field against the Serbs. So I think this is another case of Macron trying to behave much as Tony Blair did. Tony Blair was trying to mimic Churchill, turn something that was irrelevant to Britain into a Churchillian moment that he could exploit as a politician. I think Macron's trying to do something similar.
Well, I guess we're going to have to wait and see, but I'm pretty sure you're right, especially on the capacity of the French army to suddenly go into action against Russian troops in Ukraine. I'm sure that they're all like behind the scenes going, no, don't say that stuff. But we'll see what it is. But listen, Doug, thanks so much for coming on this short notice here. We really appreciate your views here.
Right. Sure. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Now, look, I want to look at a couple of other specific things he said, because we're going to tie in what he said with what Putin is saying here. And we have to hope that everybody like Putin understands, like what Doug is saying, that he believes that Macron is just posturing, that he doesn't really mean what he says. Because if Putin is not convinced of that, if he actually takes him at his word on the surface, then things could get kind of dicey. So here's let me show you some of the tweets that were going out about what Macron had said here. A couple of them that bear mentioning here is that French intervention in Ukraine cannot be ruled out, and France will do everything to make sure that Russia doesn't win. This is not a risk of war. This is war. A Russian victory in Ukraine is an existential threat to Europe and to France in particular. And Gary, throw that next tweet up there, if you will, because that's the one that's kind of critical. He said, we negotiated as much as we could, but there's nothing to talk about with Putin anymore. Ukraine must win. There will be no red lines for France. I am the president of France, and I decide. Now, that particular phrase, and talking very cocky about how Ukraine is going to win and Russia is going to lose, isn't playing well in Moscow. And just yesterday, Vladimir Putin said this.
Well, first of all, North Korea, they have a nuclear umbrella of their own. They have not asked us for anything. Secondly, from what we see now, from what's happening on the battlefield, we are doing quite fine with the goals that we have set out for ourselves. As for those states who are saying that they have no red lines in regards of Russia, well, they need to understand that Russia will have no red lines in regards of these countries.
So Putin is using the same language. Macron is saying we have no red lines. And Putin is saying, okay, you don't have red lines? We don't have red lines. And you heard Macgregor say just there a second ago that in a bad situation, if France does something specifically against the Russian armed forces, it is not inconceivable they could physically take action against France. And of course, then all bets are off and everything has the risk of escalation beyond the borders of Ukraine, which we should have been doing everything in our possible power to prevent, to keep it locked in to Ukraine and then get it over with as soon as possible. That should have been our policy. And instead, you have now Macron, when clearly things are starting to wind down, trying to ramp them back up because he doesn't want Ukraine to lose and he doesn't want Russia to win. Okay, I get it. You don't want that. But this is the reality. This is the real world that we're dealing with. And you have to deal with what it is, whether you like it or not. And listen, what we have here is a problem of our own making. This war was never going to be winnable by Ukraine. It was self-evident. It was evident for anyone who was willing to look at the facts on the ground and to understand how combat power is made at the national level and how the two sides stacked up, and realized that there was virtually no path to a Ukrainian victory. We should have recognized it earlier, got this thing negotiated and off the table, and then there would have been no existential threat for anyone. But we didn't. And now then we're in the place we're in. And because of our unwillingness to deal with reality before, now we have dug ourselves in a pit. So now we have set a stage where our situation to where we said one of our objectives was the weakening and the harm of Russia. That's what we wanted. We wanted the war to have harmed Russia and made them weaker. And instead, we are now faced with a situation to where everything that we have done, all the supplies we have made, all the help we have given Ukraine are going to be in rust on the ground and just destroyed. And then Ukraine is not going to win. Now, you want to talk about something that's going to harm our reputation and our credibility? It's putting everything on the line and saying all this stuff about Ukraine win, Russia lose, ad infinitum, and then the opposite turns out to happen. Now, that's going to be a humiliation, but that's not a nuclear war either. And the same balance of power that I told you about still exists. And even though Russia would crow and and do a happy dance, and try to put their thumb in our nose, etc. Look, the fact is, it will remain that the combined power of NATO and Western Europe will still be substantially greater than anything Russia could bring to bear. Here is what you need to understand. On a conventional level, Russia cannot roll west into NATO. They don't have the ability to do it. It doesn't matter if Putin wanted to. If Putin got this big victory over Ukraine and in euphoria wanted to keep rolling west, he couldn't do it. He doesn't have the force structure. He doesn't have the maintenance capacity. He doesn't have the logistics system that would project power over hundreds of kilometers. He simply doesn't have it. It doesn't exist and they don't have the forces either. They don't have the manpower. They don't have the equipment. It would take years and years and years to create that, even if he wanted to. So he can't do it in the foreseeable future. So there is no risk of that. And our power, our Air Force, our Navy, our missile forces, our intelligence systems, our long-range fires, our all of the tanks and everything else that we have throughout Europe that are unified and do have logistic systems and can project power, he would never risk that because it's just not a fair fight. The only risk that we have is if this goes nuclear. That is the one risk. If there's any risk to the French state, if it's an existential threat, as he said, it's through nuclear weapons. As long as it doesn't go nuclear, France has no concern about anything. They are not at risk of anything. And I hope that Doug is right. I hope that it proves that Macron is just posturing, that he's trying to sound tough, and that he knows what's going on behind the scenes. We'll see how that plays out. But you need to understand that the stuff that Macron said tonight is nonsense and is not based in any kind of capacity on reality. Now, we're going to continue to monitor this, and especially as we see whatever comes out of Moscow. I'm sure they're going to have some comment later tonight or certainly tomorrow. We'll see what the U.S. has to say, what other allies in NATO have to say, because we'll see if they want to be lining up behind possibly going to nuclear war with Russia, or if they're going to try to tell this guy he needs to be quiet and sit down. We'll see how it plays out, but you can count on us telling you. And we got a great show for you tomorrow. We're going to have Rebecca Koffler back on here, who wrote the book, Putin's Playbook, in which she predicted the Russia's attack into Ukraine in the force. So she's going to be able to give us a real good insight into what Putin may be thinking and how he's going to respond to this. That's at noon tomorrow. You definitely want to tune it in. Don't want to miss that one. But we ask you to like and subscribe to this because we remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you this kind of breaking news when it's happening and the kind of analysis that you're going to get tomorrow, which frankly, you're just not going to get anywhere else. Thank you very much, and we'll see you tomorrow on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.